All right, good afternoon, listeners. You're listening to Lament of Hope blog and podcast. I'm really excited today because I'm speaking with a narrative nonfiction journalist. And when I was doing my journalism major a couple years ago, I loved narrative nonfiction. That was my favorite class. The assignments were my favorite, and it's just so cool to get to meet someone who has made that her career, and that's just her passion. She's interviewed refugees. She's written articles for the New York Times, for Forbes, for several other prominent magazines. Um, and recently, in January of this past year, she came out with a book called Lovers in Auschwitz, which is a narrative nonfiction story that actually is based on an article she wrote in 2019 for the New York Times. And so I'm really excited to talk to her about this and just her process and the interviewing process and writing this story. Karen, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really excited for to get to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So Karen, kind of to start out, why did you want to be a journalist and what drew you specifically to narrative nonfiction? Because it is a niche and there's not a lot of journalists who do it or do it well, to be honest. Um, so what kind of drew you to that?
Well, I started my career actually outside of journalism. I always knew that I wanted to write, but I didn't think I'd actually be able to make a career out of it. So I started out working for a statistics textbook company where I wrote prefaces. And on the side, I would write fictions, short stories. And I always loved that. Eventually, I started working in public relations, and I found that I was
Mhm.
feeding journalists stories, but I didn't get to do the actual fun part of writing the stories. So I decided that I would apply to graduate school, and if I got in, I'd do it. So I did, and I took the plunge. And I just love storytelling. And I found that the truth is often more extraordinary than fiction.
Mhm.
I love meeting people, and I think journalism is such an opportunity to see the world and see things, meet people who you would otherwise never get a chance to talk to. So,
Yeah.
yes, I just love it.
Well, do you think that because a lot of people I've talked to now, they're like journalism, is dying, and maybe you should start thinking about something else. You'll not be able to really be a journalist nowadays because you're going to have to write for whatever your publication wants you to write, and you're not really going to be able to tell the truth as you see it. It's more of having to write it based on a specific perspective for which employer you're with as the writer. Is that something you've had to face, or how is it? Because with narrative nonfiction, it seems like you would be able to choose more of how you're writing the story. But it seems like in journalism in general, there's not really that many opportunities to be kind of independent in that way.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the future of journalism is something that's always, I mean, since I've had this career, it's been in flux. There's always something disrupting the current trend in journalism. There was radio, and then there was TV, and there's always been written journalism. So there's always been a fear of the new technology kind of taking over. And I think that we're still learning how to roll with it. People are figuring out different ways to monetize, and it's still not perfect. And you're right. Nowadays, anyone can have, Slack, or not Slack. What is it? Substack.
Yeah.
Uh, Anyone can do a podcast. And I think, if you do good work, people will listen to you, people will find you. So in a way, that's really exciting. And then there are ways to monetize from that. But you really have to hustle, and you really have to want it.
Do you, currently where you're at in your career, now that you've just written a book, um, do you have a specific goal you want to get to? with your career, or are you like, I've gotten to do everything I've really wanted to do with the journalistic career that I have?
I just want to keep writing stories. I just want to keep it's a life of adventures because you never know what's coming next. And for me, that's the greatest pleasure. It's discovering stories and then kind of falling in the rabbit hole, doing investigations, going into archives, interviewing people and seeing, one person leads you to another person, and suddenly you find a story that you didn't even know you were looking for. And I just want to keep doing that because for me it's a thrill.
Now, do you work independently, or and do you freelance for the other magazines, or do you work for a specific organization?
Yeah, I'm currently a freelancer, and
Okay.
for anyone who's starting off in journalism, you pretty much have to well, the way it's always worked is that you start off on staff somewhere, and you start building a reputation, you start putting together clips, and then you have something to show for your work. But it takes decades, or not decades, but years and years of establishing relationships and building that portfolio. And that's what I did. I was on the staff at Forbes for a while. And I started off as a staff writer, as a reporter. I was doing fact checking. And eventually I was a senior reporter, and then I became an editor. Um, and then I decided to go off on my own and try to find, the stories that I really wanted to write, have a little more control over my what I was doing.
What is it about, refugees and kind of those who are suffering? What drew you to that particular story?
Yeah, so I was actually, while I was at Forbes, I was writing about billionaires, which is such a niche beat to have, and it was fascinating. I met really interesting people, and eventually we started hearing about the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. And that really got my attention, and seeing the
Hmm.
photographs of people, washing ashore and that kind of thing really got my attention because my four grandparents were refugees from Eastern Europe during World War II. They
Hmm.
were all Holocaust survivors, and they survived as kids and ended up in Brazil, where I was born.
Wow.
So I had this interest in refugees, and that's when I decided to leave Forbes and to do some work, with refugees. And at first, I volunteered in Greece, so I just kind of took a break from journalism and I went to work at a refugee camp.
Wow.
And then when I came back to New York, I started researching refugees who came into the US around World War II, when immigration was really tough back then. The quotas to get into the US were really, really small. So I started doing some research, and I started discovering these incredible stories, people who survived and made it into the US
Hmm.
in very different and interesting ways. And
And
that's kind of
that's,
how I stumbled here. Yeah.
yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. When your time serving the refugee camp, were you afraid at all, like of something so unfamiliar, or did you enjoy it? Or
It was really different from anything I would have ever expected. Part of my time there, I was kind of sitting on a cliff in Lesbos, an island in Greece, kind of, and I was there from midnight until something like 4 or 5 a.m., just watching with these nighttime vision binoculars, to see if there were any dinghies coming through with refugees from Turkey. And
oh
there was
wow.
this whole network of nonprofits and volunteers who would bring blankets and food to people who came over. So I did that for a little bit of time, and then I started going to this area where the refugees, especially kids and teenagers, would go and spend their time because they really, they couldn't work, they couldn't do much, so
Yeah.
they were just spending time in this recreational center, where they could at least hang out with each other and play games. Some of the kids would go to kind of makeshift schools, and and I was there basically just hanging out with them and collecting food for them.
Hmm.
Um, and it was people from so many different places, and everyone spoke different languages, and we would communicate through Google Translate on our phones. So it was really interesting. And I met some people who I kept in touch with, and who, one guy ended up going to Berlin, and he became a filmmaker. Um, Someone else I connected with later ended up getting out of Lesbos, and he went to Athens, and we also met up a couple of years later. And then there are a lot of people that I just wasn't in touch. I wasn't able to keep up with, and I have no idea what happened with them. But it was definitely a life-changing experience. It really opened my eyes to what people were going through.
And when you were talking about all of these people that you met later, were these refugees that ended up going? Like the man you talked about who became a filmmaker, these were the refugee kids you met?
Yeah.
Wow.
Refugee kids who they were teenagers, and they had no idea what would happen next. They left their parents behind. Some of them had lost their backpacks with clothing or whatever in the boat because it fell over at some point. So they really arrived with very little.
Hmm.
Somehow they did have phones, and I think a lot of that is through donations from the volunteers and things like that. And so it was incredible to see them kind of like the strength of character that they had, and how they it was a tough situation, but they did the best they could with it.
So that experience kind of just cemented in your mind, okay, this is what I want to write about permanently, kind of thing, is people who are suffering and
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say permanently. I I think that it's definitely a topic, something that unfortunately it's not going to go away. But I I like covering this because I think it's important to shed light on these stories. And also I think that writing about people who have these new beginnings is important as well, because it's such a hopeful story. And that those are the stories that I've been writing lately. They're stories about new beginnings, people who kind of start from nothing after losing everything.
yeah. Well, that leads us kind of to your book that was published in, this past year, but you actually wrote an article, a few years before writing a book. So tell us about, the article, how you started that, how that kind of happened, and then how it led to you actually writing a book about the topic.
Yeah, so I'm gonna have to rewind a little bit. Basically, I came back from Greece, and I wanted to find stories about people who came into the US around World War II. And one of the first stories that I found, I started looking back at newspaper articles from 1945, and I started seeing this little girl, Bella, who her picture was in all the newspapers. She was 3 years old, and she was the first person to come from Europe with a visa into the United States after the war. And she was adopted by an American soldier who saw her in an orphanage and just, decided he was going to fight for her and try to get her to come with him to the US. She didn't have any family. And so she did. She came to New York. And so I saw these pictures of the little girl and the soldier and the story, and I was curious what happened to Bella. So I
Hmm.
started looking for her, and it took a long time. I fell into all sorts of rabbit holes. I would lose um, confidence. I didn't know if she was alive. And I found that the soldier who adopted her had actually gotten a divorce. So I wondered, what happened very shortly after adopting her. So it took about a year or more, and I finally found her.
Wow.
She was living, yeah. So I was able to drive to her, and she lived nearby, and she had changed her name. Bella had become Ruth, which is why it had been so difficult to find her. Um, and it turned out that the stories in the newspapers weren't quite what they seemed. The soldier had definitely been responsible for bringing her back, but he never intended to adopt her. He was bringing her to be with his family, someone else in his family who was going to take her in.
Hmm.
But because it was so difficult to bring someone to give visas out at the time, this whole group of people concocted this story, this PR angle where, an American soldier would bring this 3-year-old girl in, and it just made it an easier buy for the American public to see, this little cute girl with the soldier. So it was just when I finally met her, it was incredible. And then she had this treasure trove of documents from the war, letters that the soldier had written to the family, and all the obstacles he had, and photographs that they were sending back and forth, and then documents. So I had all these documents, um, and I decided to write a story, and that became my first New York Times story. Um, and after I wrote that, I thought, wow, there must be other examples of stories like this out there. So I decided I wanted to try to write a book about different stories of how people came to the US around World War II.
Hmm.
And uh, someone told me I should speak with David Wisnia, because David had come into the US from Poland. He had been an Auschwitz survivor. And from being an Auschwitz survivor, he actually came into the US as an American soldier. So there's this transformation somewhere in between. So I met with David. There was this whole, I got in touch with his grandson. His grandson put me in, was able to coordinate the whole thing. David was already in his 90s. So I went to his house, and we spent the day together, and he told me his story. And basically, by the age of 15, he'd found his entire family dead in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he was on his own. And soon after that, he was transported into Auschwitz.
Wow.
Um, he was near death many times, um, but he survived, and managed to escape a death march after leaving Auschwitz. And as he was running away from the Nazis, he would run away at night and sleep in barns during the day. He abandoned barns. One day he ran into American soldiers. So he's telling me this, and David was really, he had a great sense of humor, and he was so um, excited. He was so proud of being an American now. And then joining the American Army, to him, this was a dream come true. He'd always wanted to be in the United States. He had aunts here. And so he ran into American soldiers, and they adopted him, basically, gave him a uniform, they gave him a gun, And they
Wow.
said, "You're one of us." And so he went from being a prisoner to now interrogating Nazis. So he tells me this story, and I have goosebumps because it's such an incredible story. By the time he lands in the US, he's in American uniform. Um, and I'm about to leave his house. I say goodbye. I stand up, and he says, kind of casually, "By the way, I had this girlfriend while I was in Auschwitz, and we saw each other after 72 years a couple years ago." And I was
Oh.
like, yeah. So I
You're like,
sat
so do you
back
mind if I stay for dinner and maybe breakfast the next
down.
morning?
Exactly. So I sat back down and my recorder was still on. Lesson from this is never turn your recorder off until you're gone. So it's still running. And I'm like, okay, tell me about this girlfriend, because it just didn't compute. Auschwitz is a death camp and men and women are separate,
Yeah.
and there's no, it's not a social place. So he told me, yeah, I had this girlfriend. Her name was Tsippy, and she was a graphic designer. And again, my mind kind of explodes. I'm like, what's a graphic designer? Like, she was a graphic designer for the camp. And he said, yeah, yeah, yeah. That was her job description, because prisoners had different jobs in Auschwitz. And I'm thinking to myself, the typical prisoner job was, um, collecting stones to build things,
Yeah.
like burying things or people, even carrying corpses, which was actually his first job when he was in Auschwitz. He had to carry corpses of the dead and put them into trucks. And here was this woman who he says was a graphic designer. So he tells me this, and I'm kind of like, okay. And he told me that there was a book written about her, an academic book by 5 different historians. Um, and it was edited by a director at the Holocaust Museum in DC, and that I should look it up. And so I did. Immediately I get home and I'm like, okay, I need to find this book, and I look it up and I find it, and I find her, and I started reading about her, and I was just knocked over by her personality, and her story. She was just this incredible person. And once I fell in that rabbit hole, I just needed to write that story. And so I spoke with David and I said, I'd love to uh, make an article, try to pitch an article. And he was like, sure. Um, and he had done several interviews before with like BuzzFeed, but it was never about the romance. And I was really kind of fixated on his story, but also her story, because she had an incredible story. So I pitched the story to the New York Times. They took it, and I wrote it. And as I was writing it, there was just so much that just, you have a space limit for a story in the Times. You can't include all the, juicy details and the incredible details. And so I wrote the story for the Times, but then I was like, this needs to be a book.
Wow.
And that's kind of how that happened.
So did you spend, because that was 2019 when the article came out. So how many years did you spend writing the book?
So I started writing in 2020. The article came out December of 2019. I started in 2020, which was also the beginning of the pandemic. And it was also, I had a toddler and I was pregnant.
Wow.
So it took me a while to write the book.
Did you get to
Uh,
meet the lady or had she passed away?
No, unfortunately, I didn't get to meet her. She had already passed away by the time I met David and learned her story. So that was really challenging because, obviously I wanted to have her voice there, and I needed to I wanted to ask her so many questions. And she didn't have kids. Her husband had passed away. So I reached out to the historians who interviewed her. And then I found family of hers that lived in Prague, and in Australia. And I just called anyone who was alive who could talk to me about her.
Mm.
And she also left a lot of oral testimony. So I was able to, listen to videotapes and to see her in certain tapes. I was able to hear her voice. And then we were talking earlier about persistence in journalism before we got on this uh, video, but I had read somewhere in a footnote in a memoir that something came from an unpublished manuscript by Tsippi. And I asked all the historians that I spoke with, what's this unpublished manuscript? And none of them had heard of it. And I was like, how can that be? Like, it has to be something, you know? So
Mm.
I so I was asking anyone who knew anyone, and eventually I asked this professor at the University of South Carolina who had worked with someone who had written the memoir from the original footnote. Um, and she was like, "Yeah, I have all the woman's, this woman's papers, the woman who wrote the memoir. Her name was Susan, but I haven't seen an unpublished manuscript." And so I was bummed. I kind of felt like I hit a dead end. But I would still check in with her every few months, be like, "Are you sure you don't have an unpublished manuscript?"
We are so similar.
Right? So after about a year, I was going for a run in Prospect Park when I got a text message from the woman at the University of North Carolina. And she says in all caps, "I found the manuscript." And so I stop on my tracks and I call her immediately. And I was like, "What? What?" And she says, "Yeah, I was cleaning out my guest bedroom and there was this cardboard box and in it was the manuscript. And it's 100+ pages. Um, and it's amazing." And so I was like, "Well, how soon can I get it? What do you need me to do? I'll drive over there, I'll fly over there." She ended up photographing every single page of the manuscript on her phone and sending it to me so I could have it immediately. And
Wow.
and that really made a difference in the book because it added, more, even more of her voice and more detail.
And the manuscript was like her story of her time in Auschwitz, or?
Yeah, she had written about her
Wow.
time in Auschwitz.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did she mention the guy at all? Or no?
No, so that's another thing. She never mentioned him in any of her formal interviews, which as a journalist, you have to check everything out, right? So the fact that this was only coming from his side, I needed to find a way to verify from her
Yeah.
side. And I couldn't publish anything even before the article came out. I wasn't going to publish anything until I had some sort of confirmation. Um, so I did speak with a historian who told me that she had told him the story and she had told him some of the details. So he was able to confirm it. And once I had that, and I had some audio of David and Sippy talking during the reunion. Once I had all that, I felt comfortable sharing the story.
Oh, so
But
he actually recorded their reunion, getting back together.
a little bit of it,
Mm.
and there's a documentary called "How Saba Kept Laughing," or it's something like that. That plays a little bit of that audio too, so you'll be able to hear it if you see it.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, obviously you want people to read the book. So we can't go into everything that you wrote, but what is one thing about their story that you put in the book that just amazed you about their relationship or about how, they connected or,
Yeah.
how.
There was so much about it that was amazing, about their relationship, about Auschwitz in general, seeing how the prisoners' lives worked and ways that they resisted as prisoners, that nobody ever kind of talks about. There was a lot of resistance going on, especially in the women's camp. But I think something that really touched me about their relationship was that, when you registered into Auschwitz, you were shaved, your clothing was stripped from you, you were given a uniform, and your entire body was shaved. You were um, given a uniform and you were tattooed with a number on your forearm. So you were stripped of an identity. You became this number. And to me, once David and Sippy found each other and they were able to meet, just the two of them in hiding, they created this kind of nest in one of the warehouses where the Nazis kept all the confiscated clothing. They created this like little hollow nest where they were able to hide. And once they were in there, they became human again. They were David and Sippy. They weren't numbers on their forearms. Um, and I think that's what their relationship kind of highlighted to me, that even in hell and in the worst place you can imagine,
Hmm.
people were still able to connect and to find some sort of hope by being together.
Wow. I did want to ask though, I guess, well, he took the chance to run away. So I guess that's how they kind of disconnected for so long, right?
Yeah, after the war, everyone had to go on death marches, and men and women were separate. So he went on his death march, and then he ran away from the death march, and she was on her death march, and they all went in different directions.
Okay.
And they had made a plan to meet up in Warsaw, but their lives kind of deviated. And she actually went to Warsaw and she waited for him, but he, had joined the American Army. So their lives moved in different directions, and
Wow.
yeah, and it took a long time to reconnect.
How did you know that how did you find out that she waited for him?
It was in one of the testimonies, and also she told him when they reunited.
My goodness. Yeah, that's such a treasure trove of a story to write about.
Yeah,
Listeners, I highly encourage you to get this book and read it.
thank
Because
you.
I think that's what's so, you know, the Holocaust in general is a very dark topic. And so for most people, it's like, you just have like a really morbid interest in it and want to know all about it. Or you're like, don't want to talk about it, don't want to see movies on it. No, 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 it's too much for me, can't handle it. But it's interesting because your book kind of takes, yes, there's this really dark situation, which is real, but then you take these humans and you find their story, and there's a way to almost humanize the event and give it this personableness so that people can, yeah, you're learning history, but you're also learning about two people who actually ended up surviving. And so there is that hopeful kind of end to it, which, I mean, that's just such a unique opportunity that you got to write about.
Yeah, I think that often the Holocaust is very two-dimensional because you think about the ovens, you think about
Yeah.
killing, the shooting, and just the horror of it. And like I said, people tend to become numbers. And that's part of what connected me with the story. They're not numbers, they're people. And I started looking into their past, and you see what they, the families they grew up in, and their
Hmm.
normal childhood, and their dreams when they were kids, and then all of it disrupted by the war, and then all the terror. But they remain, kids with dreams, with hopes, with feelings, um, and they have to move through all this terror. And I think that seeing the actual people living through this um, helps understand, and it helps, yeah, it helps you get through that if you're reading it, because you have like a deeper connection
Yeah.
to the characters.
I wonder
Yeah.
if they'll end up making a movie about your book, because it would make a good movie.
We'll see.
Would you like that?
um if they did a good job with it, sure.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna ask you, you were mentioning like writing a story when you were pregnant and had a toddler. Like, how have you combined being, because a journalist is always on, it's like, even with this small podcast, as I'm trying to get interviews and people, it's like I get an email at 11 p.m. or I get a call from an agent at, 9:45 because in California it's 6:45 or um you know you you're thinking in your mind, you're laying in bed and you're thinking of all the people you could ask and you're like, what would be an interesting topic to think about? And honestly, it's really hard because like you're excited about what you're doing, but you're also like, I need to turn this off because like my husband's right here and he's talking to me and I'm not listening to what, you know what I mean? Like there's almost like there's just such an excitement about it, but at the same time there are these people that you live with and you love and you've devoted some of your life, to being part of their story, and here you are trying to find and write all these stories. Like, how do you balance the two? Have you found that you can? Have you, grown discouraged in that? Like, how have you combined where it's like, I can still pursue what I love, but at the same time, I can care for the people I love well. And that just seems to me like that's such a hard thing to do. Like, because I don't have kids. So I think even of having children, it's like, am I going to just have to give up the journalism dream for a while?
Well, I think that you kind of go through ebbs and flows, and there are definitely points where I'm getting started on a story or I'm looking for ideas, and it's like you described, almost, an obsession, and it's hard to turn it off. The pandemic was going on, and so I was actually living with my parents, and they were helping me with childcare. But I would have this strict amount of time that I would, be working on the book. And come 3 o'clock, I'd leave, and that was it. I'd be with my kids. Of course, if I got a phone call, it was nice to have my parents around, and to be able to be like, okay, I have to go take this. Um, but yeah, it's tough. It's a balancing act. There are moments when I've been promoting the book that I've had to just, not say no to certain things because I have to be with my family. I have to prioritize my kids. And it's just you kind of learn how to balance things out.
Have you found that the same, like with your relationship with your husband as well? Like, do you work as a team with it or?
Yeah, yeah. He's a workaholic. We
Okay.
have we have very different working styles. And I think being a journalist freelancer, I have a little bit more flexibility. So I'm able to, take off in the middle of the day to go, be with my kids if I need to. And then I'll, make up for it in the evening. So we were able to kind of juggle it. But it's tough. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna lie, it is tough. It's a challenge.
Well, Karen, I'm so, grateful for this time that you took to talk with me about this. One last question I had for you is, um, as a journalist and doing it for so long, um, what's one thing you wish you knew when you started out that you know now?
Um, I let's see. I mean, when I was in college, I kind of wish I'd just gone for it. I was afraid of taking the plunge into journalism because I wanted something safe. And I think that I should have gone for it. But on the other hand, I got to know the world of textbook statistics. I, I you just have to take lessons from everything, and also keep in touch with people. Always ask them, if there's someone else you should talk to. Always try to, I think Nora Ephron used to say, everything's copy. There's a story in nearly everything.
Yeah. Well, Karen, thank you so much again. It's been so great to talk with you. And for listeners, there will be a link to her website, and you'll see the book literally just pops up right on the homepage, and ways to buy that or, find it and read it. So again,
Thank
Karen, thank you so much. And listeners, if you do read it, write in the comments below what you like, and feel free to reach out to Karen. Karen, I think there's a contact on your email, right? For people to let you
There
know if
is,
they've
yeah.
yeah, if they liked the book and how they liked it. So, well, Karen, thank you again so
Great.
much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. It's nice to meet you.
You too.